Hello and welcome back to the Week in Nintendo right here on GVG. I'm your host this week, Steve Bowling, and this week is a bit of a different episode because there are actually no co-hosts. So this is just a solo episode of the Week in Nintendo, kind of like we used to do when this was a Patreon exclusive show back a long time ago these days. So it's nice to do kind of a different vibe for the show every now and then. We have some great stories for you this week, even though the Switch 2 is just around the corner. And speaking of which, we have the first marketing push for the Nintendo Switch 2 happening now from a familiar face to Nintendo fans. Xenoblade Chronicles X has finally launched, and it carries with it a very interesting secret hiding in its code. On top of that, we have another piece of Nintendo history that has just been unearthed. A new Nintendo PlayStation prototype has been found and photographed. So we've got all that, plus your questions from the Winner's Circle this week on the podcast. Let's go ahead and start by jumping in with the Nintendo Switch 2 marketing push, because there's not a lot to this story, but it is interesting to see this happening, especially ahead of the April 2nd Direct, which is, as of this recording, about a week away. I can't wait. I'm so excited to learn more about the Switch 2, and we don't have to wait long. I presume that at that Direct, we'll get all the details, price, release date, launch titles, you name it. And I don't think it'll be as far away as some people might think. I think we're just about 3 months away right now from the release of the Switch 2, if even that. But Nintendo has started marketing the Switch 2 more openly. Obviously, they've revealed it, they've shown it off on their socials, but you haven't seen commercials. And I think after the April 2nd Direct, that's all going to change. We're going to see ads everywhere for this thing. But there is a subtle piece of marketing out there right now on the jerseys of the Major League Baseball team, the Seattle Mariners. And if you're not up on both Nintendo and baseball, you might have some difficulty understanding why this. Why is this the avenue that they're choosing? But most Nintendo fans these days know that Nintendo of America, as a show of goodwill in the 90s, actually purchased the Seattle Mariners. They owned the entire team for a long time, and some interesting stuff came of that. Nintendo stuff on their jerseys is nothing new. It's a very tight-knit partnership. In fact, there was even a Seattle Mariners edition Nintendo DS Lite that you could buy if you went to a home game at the stadium. So what is the rub here? There are two versions of the jersey. There is the home jersey and the away game jersey. And the home game jersey just has a Nintendo logo on the classic red on the sleeve. And the away game jersey actually has Nintendo Switch 2 branding on the sleeve. They've shown these both off on the Seattle Mariners social media accounts. But that's really the long and short of this story. Nintendo is starting to market the Switch 2, marketing it to outside audiences, I guess, because people who are super into baseball may not necessarily be into video games. That's not a surprise to anybody. But also, you're trying to get the Switch 2 name out in front of people now, ahead of this Direct even, so that people start to get curious and learn about it. This is nothing new. If you remember the Switch 1 reveal trailer, Nintendo showed off NBA games in the actual trailer, just kind of casting a wide net to show people this is what this can do. This is what this console is capable of. These are the types of games that will be on it. Nintendo did a really great job in 2016 actually, with the Switch 1 reveal trailer showing off, games that folks like you and me who might make or listen to Nintendo podcasts would love. We had Mario, we had Breath of the Wild, we have Splatoon 2. But then games other gamers might want, like Skyrim, which is a super popular game, but obviously there's no guarantee that somebody who's super into Mario or Zelda will also like Skyrim. In fact, I personally don't really love Skyrim. It's not a series, or Elder Scrolls is not a series, and Skyrim is not a game that I get a ton of enjoyment out of. And I know I'm probably wrong about that, but it takes all kinds. And so this was an interesting moment because obviously Nintendo is now showing off the Switch 2 brand outside of their more traditional marketing circles. And it makes me wonder, obviously MLB The Show 25 is right around the corner, or just came out. I can't remember which as of the recording of this. And I would be willing to bet that there will be a pretty nice Switch 2 upgrade for it. Now, when we talk about Switch 2 upgrades, we have to talk about Xenoblade Chronicles X. Because the game is out now, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but in the code of the game, there was a 60 FPS mode discovered, an incomplete 60 FPS mode, kind of the vestigial remains of it. All I could glean is that if this is somehow activated by hacking the game, that the game itself acts weird, which isn't a surprise. I'm guessing that there are some optimizations there that were made that aren't really complete. What I think this is a testing bed for how Switch 2 upgrades could work for Switch 1 games. So obviously, Nintendo is no stranger to the fact that, there are different performance profiles for the Nintendo Switch. Obviously, handheld and docked mode are the ones that exist currently, meaning that a game needs to be optimized for both. And that may be something as simple as dropping dynamic resolutions to a lower degree so that it still runs at whatever your target frame rate is in handheld mode. Because obviously CPU clocks come up when you put it in the dock because it has a consistent power supply and it's able to cool more efficiently because it's not going to drain the battery to do so. So you may end up with the ability to have higher resolutions. Now, you could make a third performance profile. We don't necessarily know what is going to be in the Switch 2 from a CPU or GPU perspective. Nintendo certainly does, though. And with Xenoblade Chronicles X almost certainly being the last real big game to release before Switch 2 hardware drops, presumably in a couple of months, it makes sense that they may have tested this much more thoroughly against the Switch 2 than other games. And it may already have in its code, or at least in an upcoming update, some baked in Switch 2 performance updates, meaning that if it's put onto a Switch 2, either digitally or via cart, it will detect the additional horsepower of the hardware and be able to make use of that either by increasing the resolution of the game, or in the case of what I believe to be the case with Xenoblade Chronicles X, just doubling the frame rate to 60 FPS. Now, obviously, we may learn about this pretty soon. At the April 2nd Direct, I suspect that Nintendo will talk about how Switch 1 games run on Switch 2 and what upgrades they get, if any. So where do we go from here? I think that we're going to see a whole host of Switch 1 games that run better on Switch 2. I think we're going to see just overall across the board improvements in a lot of games that have seen performance issues. Games like Hyrule Warriors, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. These are fantastic games, but they all have performance issues that are pretty visible even to the least frame rate sensitive people if you go to collect the Master Sword in Breath of the Wild, you're going to notice major frame drops. If you're using Ultra Hand in Tears of the Kingdom, you're going to notice that the game slows down, certainly not to an unplayable degree, but to a noticeable degree. And Hyrule Warriors is pretty much framey all the time. So I think there are very obvious, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, are games that you will notice these issues in pretty easily, even if you're not a very frame rate focused person. I think Nintendo will take this opportunity to show these games running at much better resolutions during the April 2nd Direct, though everything I say should be taken with a shovel full of salt because I have no idea. I have no idea what Nintendo's going to do. It just seems like an obvious choice. But let's talk about Xenoblade Chronicles X, or Xenoblade Chronicles X. It is a really fun game. I picked it up on the Wii U way back in the day in Japanese, which was an inadvisable choice even for somebody who understands enough of the language to converse and get by, because I certainly speak a lot better than I read, especially where Japanese is concerned. You could probably say that about every language, but certainly where Japanese is concerned. And I don't know what I was thinking, because I tried to dig into the game. I tried to follow it. I've imported many, many games in the past and not had this issue, but I wasn't able to gain much traction in Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Wii U. And I kind of dropped the game and just never played it after that because I couldn't figure it out. I'm pleased to report that in a post Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3 world, having tried this again, Xenoblade Chronicles X is a lot of fun. I created a character. I've put a couple of hours in so far as of the recording of this episode. I will be putting more hours in tonight so that I can delve further into the game. I'm still in the first chapter, but I'm having lots of fun with it. It is every bit as beautiful as I had hoped. The open world is as amazing as the ones in 2 and 3, and NLA seems like an interesting place. It is probably a game that I think it will be the Switch one's not really last hurrah, but probably considered to be the last big game that came out before the Switch 2 dropped. And I have a feeling that Nintendo is probably not going to invest the same level of effort in these once Switch 2 comes out. So we'll have to see what they're going to do. But Xenoblade Chronicles X is super interesting. It's an interesting case study of a game. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the final PlayStation prototype that we've seen. This came directly from Ken Kutaragi, which makes sense. Ken Kutaragi is renowned as the father of PlayStation, and he recently spoke to and was photographed by a famous Japanese photographer. And somehow, between the two of them, the topic of the Nintendo PlayStation came up. If you're not versed in that bit of Nintendo history, here's how it goes. Nintendo was trying to compete with the Sega 32X and the upcoming Sega Saturn, and decided that they needed their own CD-ROM based add-on for the Super Famicom, also known as the Super NES here in the States during the 16-bit era. And they had initially contracted with Philips. Philips was going to make a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES that would allow it to just really use the CD medium for games. This would have enabled a number of things, higher quality music, because if you don't know, the SNES and systems before it all rendered out MIDI music, which is really a great way to make music that saves on storage, but just doesn't sound true to life the way that, CD audio did at the time. It also would have allowed for full motion video and, of course, heaps more storage at much lower cost. Cartridges were notoriously expensive back in those days, with bigger games costing over $100 in 1990s money, which would be hundreds of dollars by today's standards. So when people say that games being $70 is a bit of a ripoff, you should really go back and look at like a Toys R Us catalog from the US from the 80s and 90s, and you would see that they were charging much higher than that back in the 8 and 16-bit days. I mean, I'm not saying that $70 is not a ripoff. It certainly feels that way in the context of the current day, and for a lot of games, it feels like a huge overprice. But yeah, games used to be even more expensive, especially when you account for inflation. Even the $50 games of yesteryear would be $70 or $80 today in $20-25. So it's an interesting equation, interesting math to do, but that's not what we're talking about. So Nintendo basically at the very last minute shunned Philips when the formal announcement of the CD-ROM project was coming to pass, and gave the contract to Sony. And because of this, two things happened. So there was the birth of the CDI, which got the horrible Zelda games, Wand of Gamelon, and such, because Nintendo had to make Philips happy after shutting down that contract with them to pursue a better deal with Sony. But then, of course, Nintendo pulled the plug on Sony as well. But Sony got a lot further than Nintendo did. So you had the Nintendo PlayStation, which was not just a Super Famicom add-on, but a combo machine. It took Super Famicom cartridges up top, and then in the front, underneath the controller ports, it had a CD reader. And what makes this even more interesting is that software was actually developed for this. Some of it has been found and dumped online and preserved, while some of it, is still out in the ether somewhere. I presume in the years and decades that ensue, we might actually see some more stuff for the Super CD, is what it was going to be called. But right now, this is all we have. And for the longest time, there was a Nintendo PlayStation prototype out there that has been making the rounds. It was sold into a private collection and has made trips around to various retro gaming expos. I actually got to play the Nintendo PlayStation back when I lived in Arizona at a retro gaming expo there, the One Up Game Expo. I was there, and the Nintendo PlayStation was there, and I briefly got to hold a controller and play some Super Mario World on it. I was amazed. I was amazed that I had seen that, because I remember seeing a photo of a very similar prototype, maybe even the same one, in EGM as a child. So to find out that Ken Kutaragi, who it would make sense for him to have one, but that he held onto one and had it in pristine condition in his home, was very interesting. I would have loved to see them try to actually fire it up and get it working. I'm sure that Sony actually has several of these locked away in a vault somewhere, the same way Nintendo has many prototypes of their own in a vault somewhere. Tangentially, Nintendo prototypes sometimes end up just on Yahoo Auctions Japan as people leave the company or during estate sales or whatever happens. Prototypes for Nintendo products end up on Yahoo Auctions Japan. I talked about this in a very long gone episode of the Week in Nintendo, but there was one that was on auction, a thought to be lost Super Famicom prototype that went up for sale and I think ended up costing more than a house. But people get their hands on these and they end up in the hands of private collectors. And honestly, they almost never see the light of day. So it was very cool to see Ken Kutaragi show off his personal Nintendo PlayStation now that he's no longer with the company. That said, it is a quiet week. It's almost like we're on the eve of the Switch 2 Direct. And because of that, there are not a lot of news stories to go around. So we're going to have a bit of a more focused mailbag section this week. Normally, a co-host and I will pick one topic. I'm going to try to go through as many of them as I can while still respecting your time, those of you out there listening, because I know that we're only about 16 minutes in now. But let's go ahead and start with Legend of Jess, who writes, with Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition releasing in less than 6 hours, this was obviously submitted a little bit ago, what's your experiences with the series? What's been the highlights? So I guess as I've not spoken much about my experiences with Xenoblade Chronicles, but I'm a fan of the series these days. So I have played 2 and 3. I've played Torna, and I've not yet played the DLC for 3. I actually wrote IGN's guide for 2. I was freelancing at the time that 2 was on the horizon, and I focused all of my energy on that game. Played through it with my best friend, and we took notes, and I compiled those notes into a guide, captured lots of screenshots, lots of video clips. It was a very extensive process. I had never done a guide that big in my entire life. And I'm quite proud of it. I think that the guide came out very well. I think that it helped people understand what to do and where to go. And because I had such a thorough experience with Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I became a fan of the series. I really enjoyed it when the game actually came out, because if you don't know, usually if you're writing a guide for a game, you're doing it before the game comes out so that people are there on day one with a complete guide. So I had a couple of weeks to do that, and it was a lot of fun. One of the most fun experiences I've had writing for games. I enjoy making guides. I've written a ton of them in my time. I would like to do more someday. But yeah, it's a really fun experience. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is one of my favorite RPGs that I've ever played. I really like the characters. I really like the world. I really like the setting. And I got to interview the developers of it and actually give Numa her name, or rather have them confirm her name, because up to that point they had not canonically confirmed that her name was Numa. So that was my contribution to the Xenoblade community. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I enjoyed immensely. I had a lot of fun with that as well. But my experience outside of that is going to be that I watched my brother play through Xenogears. Neither of us played Xenosaga. And I know that those are only tangentially connected, but there's some kind of a connection there. I mean, Cosmos was in Xenoblade Chronicles too. But that is basically the extent of my experience with it. I'd like to finish Xenoblade Chronicles X, so I'm going to hope to do that before the release of the Switch 2, which gives me plenty of time, but we'll see if that happens. But thank you for the question. Next up, we have Dat Alpha Lion, who writes, what third-party company's retro game catalog do you happen to own a sizable chunk of on the Switch? Looking through my collection, I have a ton of Capcom fighting games, a large Genesis library from Sega and others, and even a massive amount of Konami games through the various collections they've put out over the years. My 3 most recent physical pickups just happen to be Konami collections, Rocket Knight, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Suikoden. I would have to say Square Enix. I have a lot of their back catalog. I have just about every Final Fantasy game. I have a few Dragon Quest games on here now. As far as back catalog games, I'd have to think more on it, but I would say Square Enix is almost certainly the answer there, just because I wanted to have every single Final Fantasy that I could playable portably, and the Switch is obviously the way to do that. So that would be my selection for that one. I think that that's an easy go-to there. But thank you for the question. Next up, we have Azran127. What do you think Kirby's getting up to for Switch 2 season? A follow-up to Forgotten Land, a classic 2D experience, a gimmicky spin-off a la Canvas Curse that uses the mouse con, or something else entirely? So with Kirby, I don't know. I would say that we're probably going to get something akin to a sequel to Forgotten Land, in that the mechanics will be very similar. The presentation will be very similar because I think people really resonated well with that. I'm just hoping that it's a bit larger in scope. I remember in the lead up to Forgotten Land, really, really hoping that it was going to be a more open kind of game, like Kirby's version of Super Mario Odyssey. We obviously didn't get that. So I would have to say that I think that that would be where I'd hope for the series to go. That being said, Kirby tends to surprise me at every turn. Every time we get a new Kirby, it's not what I thought it would be. And we got a lot of them in this generation. It felt for a while like you couldn't go 6 months without a new Kirby game being announced, or at least a remake or a re-release or something Kirby related happening all the time. I think it's probably because developers can be a bit more experimental with Kirby, because Kirby is less of like a A-list Nintendo character and more of like a B-list, that they are less set with what the identity of the character is. So, Mario, Nintendo kept him kind of sanitized for years. You had a certain representation of Mario and that was what you got. And I think the same is true for a lot of other representations of characters in games. So I'm not really 100%, but I would say that we're likely to get something on the scale of Forgotten Land. I think Nintendo wants to show off what the Switch 2 can do, and the best way to differentiate the Switch 2 from the original is to show the stark increase in visual fidelity. So we'll see what happens, but I kind of think that's where they're headed with it. Thank you so much for the question, Azran. We have Kairuto, who writes, do you think that the recent news about Alarmo using a Hall effect for its control knob has any bearing on Nintendo also potentially using Hall effect sticks for the Switch 2 Joy-Cons and Pro Controller? The short answer here is no. And the long answer is, I think they made this decision long before Alarmo. I would be very surprised if the Switch 2 did not use Hall effect sticks. And let's go ahead and break this down for why I think this. I've got my Switch Lite here for illustrative purposes, but these sticks have been the most common failure point on Nintendo's console for the last 8 years. It's been a big deal, and it has cost Nintendo a lot of money. They had to publicly acknowledge that there were issues with the sticks in the Joy-Con and offer an extended repair program while kind of silently revising the Joy-Con over and over again over the course of the console's life. So that means that they had additional R&D costs. They had a lot of repair costs. They had a lot of warranty claims to settle. And if I remember correctly, somebody sued them for this. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure. But Nintendo suffered some headaches. They took some lumps for their decisions on how to design the Joy-Cons specifically. People didn't really give the Pro Controller as much grief, but it is the same stick module, or at least a similar stick module in the Pro Controller. So Nintendo probably got a lot of warranty complaints, and it became such a big thing that even if it wasn't a ton of warranty complaints, it was a very visible issue. A lot of people talked about this when the Switch was new on the market, and Joy-Con kind of got a reputation for not being reliable. And Nintendo is a company that historically has enjoyed a strong reputation for build quality and reliability of their hardware. So this was kind of a rare, public issue for them, in the generation. Like if you think back to the PS3 and the 360, when those consoles were failing left and right, Nintendo was sitting pretty with the Wii. Not a lot of people complaining about their hardware. There's that famous Game Boy that took a hit in a war and melted, but still worked, that was on display in the Nintendo store in New York for many years. So there's lots of different things that Nintendo has gone through over the years, but the Joy-Con drift and stick issues are probably one of the most visible, notable hardware issues Nintendo has had. Very few people don't know about Nintendo's struggles in that front. So what do they do to fix this? Obviously they could announce that they put Hall effect sensors in all of their stuff. I mean, cheaper third-party controllers are now releasing with better sensors or better stick modules than Nintendo's own. So I think it would be really a hard sell for them to say, like, we're still not going to do that. Now, that being said, of course, I have no insider knowledge. Nintendo is going to Nintendo. They might just still stick with it. I don't know. I don't know if maybe the magnets in the new Joy-Con could potentially preclude them from using Hall effect sensors, but we'll wait and see. But that being said, I think they have done this. I think it would be the smart move. It would give the hardware more of a premium feel. It would make it last longer, work better, which is always a good thing. And Nintendo would get a much desired boost from, people speaking positively about the inclusion of Hall effect. So I think that it would be a win for both Nintendo and the consumer, but I don't think Alarmo is why they did it. I think Alarmo just happens to have it. Now, you could make the argument that Nintendo is sourcing loads of Hall effect sensors, and maybe they used the same ones for Alarmo because they were already buying them for the Switch 2. But yeah, I don't think Alarmo is what precipitated this. I think Nintendo already had this decision made likely many years ago at this point. So I don't think, I guess if there was a bearing, I would say that the bearing would be that Nintendo is ordering these in mass because they're already using them for their new generation of hardware. Thus, Alarmo gets it as well, because that way you don't have to keep ordering different components. If you could reuse a Switch 2 component in Alarmo, then, from a corporate perspective, that would make a lot of sense. So that would be the bearing that I could see. So that would be the bearing that I could see for it, but that's about as far as it goes. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think people should read tea leaves, connections between Alarmo and Switch 2. I don't think that's wise. But thank you for the question, Kairudo. Continuing on with Alarmo, we have JoyQuest 3 who writes, since we randomly get a new theme for Alarmo before getting Animal Crossing, that means there is hope for more Alarmo themes. What themes do you want to see it get? I kind of want Tetris myself after it was dropped on Nintendo Music. I'd also like a DKC 3 one, but I'm not going to hold out hope for that. So as far as Alarmo themes, honestly, now that I don't sleep alone, Alarmo is a little hard for me to use day to day. Alarmo does not function well as an alarm clock for beds with more than one person in them, as I noted in my video that I made about it back last October. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't want to see more features on it. I would love to see a Wind Waker theme. I would love to see a theme based maybe on... We already have Splatoon. I want the Animal Crossing theme really badly. I'd like to see them do themes for more obscure games. Like, give me a Nintendo Land theme, or give me a, what was its name? Musashi theme. The one about the mysterious Murasame Castle. There we go. Or give me an Emio theme. That'd be fun. Like, I would like some creepy ones. But yeah, I would say my most desired one would be Wind Waker. Just bright colors, nice sound effects. You could give me a reason to have my Alarmo play ocean sounds to fall asleep to. I would like that. I think that would be a great use of the hardware. Let's do one more and then we'll wrap up this episode. It'll be a bit shorter. We don't have additional folks here. So let's go ahead and try this one. Bane 400 writes, Nintendo had a mixed relationship with pack-in games in the past. Do you think Switch 2 will include one? And if so, any guesses on what it might be? So this is going to be a bit of a boring answer, but I would say there's a 95% chance that there is no pack-in game with the Switch 2. Obviously, Switch 1 did not have a pack-in game. Nintendo Land was a pack-in for deluxe consoles only, and Wii Sports was not a pack-in game in Nintendo's native Japan. They fought against... Nintendo of America basically had to campaign NCL to let them put Wii Sports in the box with the Wii. So to me, it's very clear. The messaging is clear that Nintendo doesn't really believe that pack-in games are necessary any longer. I think that it was a concept that worked well in the 80s when people were unfamiliar with the concept of video games. This gave them something like, oh, hey, you buy this and it's ready to go out of the box. You have everything you need. You got 2 controllers, you've got the hookups, you've got the power cord, and you've got a game. Or in the case of North America, in a lot of cases, 2 games on 1 cartridge. Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt is what was on mine. with the Super NES, you got Super Mario World. And even then, not every Super NES came with a pack-in game. Mine didn't as a kid. My Super NES came with a copy of Populous my dad bought in a Costco bundle. Like, it was just the console, and then they just threw a retail copy of Populous, like, in with it, like, just as a separate, like, they didn't charge you for the game. But, you know, those bundles were something later in life. But if we keep going, I can keep going with this. The N64 did not come with a game. You know, the GameCube did not come with a game. Nintendo doesn't like pack-in games. And I think that because later on in consoles' lives, Nintendo does do pack-ins, that a lot of folks equate that in their childhoods with the notion that, you know, pack-in games used to be more prevalent, but it's actually not very accurate. Nintendo almost never does pack-in titles. In fact, they try to avoid it because they know that they can sell you a game. If you're going to buy a console, you're not going to just get the console and go home. You're going to buy a couple of games or just a game, but you have to have one. And Nintendo knows that they can either give you that game for free or you can buy it for, let's just say in the case of the Switch 2, probably $70. So what happens? You know, do they leave the money on the table as a gesture of goodwill to the consumer, or do they do what most corporations do and collect that money? And the answer is that they collect the money. Nintendo, when a console is on the decline or they're in a very competitive posture, in other words, you know, PS5 has come out, Xbox Series has come out, and they want to make their offering more appealing, they'll throw a game in. Every holiday season, we've seen Mario Kart 8 bundled in with the Switch. But then once that season's over, we're back to just the Switch on the shelf with no added game. We saw Mario Wonder for Mario Day, but that's not a permanent bundle. So, do I think Switch 2 will come with a game? Unfortunately not. If it did come with a game, it would have to be something, in my opinion, similar to 1-2 Switch. Something that explains something new about the console. Something that helps you acclimate to the new hardware. You know, Sony did a digital pack-in game with Astrobot. I could see maybe something like that. If you want to give people a game that maybe shows off what the new Joy-Con can do, something that utilizes mouse mode and whatever other features the Joy-Con may have, something that uses voice chat, maybe just a free NSO game, you know, that you get with a trial subscription that's included in the box, something like that. But do I think there will be a full-fledged retail game in the box? Unfortunately, no. And with that, that is going to do it for the week in Nintendo. Thank you guys so much for watching or listening. If you're here on YouTube or out on Spotify, if you'd like to get episodes of the week in Nintendo a day early, you can do so by joining our winner's circle over at patreon.com/gvgaming, where for as little as $5 a month, you can both support the channel and submit your topics for our podcast every week. That's going to do it for me. Next week we'll be that much closer to Switch 2. It's hard to believe we are just under 2 weeks away. I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about in the coming weeks, especially in a post-Switch 2 Direct world. Again, thank you all for hanging out with me, for giving me a chunk of your Saturday, and I will see you next time. Until then, bye.